Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you may be joining us from today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio, and I am the CFAL York Operations Coordinator. I would like to officially open the fourth session in our Localizing the Canadian Supply Chain, Understanding Sector-Specific Impacts on U.S. Tariffs speaker series. I would like to begin today with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Toronto and has been caretaken by the Anishnawbe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and that the territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event and our participants may be joining from various locations, I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I welcome our moderator, our speakers, and our participants from around the world. Welcome to our webinar. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Janet Song. With expertise in community development, business leadership, and strategic operations, Janet is committed to driving meaningful impact. Previously, as Senior Operations Lead at the Canadian Urban Institute, she helped administer the $15 million My Main Street grant program to support business growth in Southern Ontario. Previously, as Executive Director of the Prince Rupert and District Chamber of Commerce, she championed economic development for over 250 businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic. She also revitalized immigrant services at Hecate Strait Employment Development Society, launching a community garden, public farmers market plans, and large-scale job fairs. Her passion for social impact and sustainability is reflected in her work with organizations like the United Nations Global Compact Network Canada, Public Inc., and the Canadian Cancer Society. With a strong track record in project management, event coordination, and community engagement, she continues to drive economic growth, sustainability, and inclusive development. Janet, thank you very much for moderating today's session and with all of your help putting the series together. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Francesco. I'm going to get started in sharing my screen. Thank you, everyone. I'm so excited to share the critical sector session with you today. And I want to go through a few housekeeping rules to ensure that we're having an engaging session where we encourage diversity of thought that is respectful and courteous. And there's multiple ways to engage, such as the chat box. Please introduce yourself, your title, where you're from. Also, the Q&A section chat where you can input any questions that we'll get to after the first part of the session. And then we also invite you to raise your hand, and we'd love to hear your voice when we have a roundtable session. Following up, we'll have a post-event summary and some shared resources that will be emailed to the attendees. And if you attended 50% of these sessions, you'll get a certificate of completion from CFAL York. So a little bit about the speaker series is that it focuses on understanding the Canadian supply chain and how we can localize it given the threat of tariffs from the US. And we look sector by sector on it for every 2 weeks for 1 hour between April and June. And we feature insights from industry experts. We first looked at automotive manufacturing, agriculture and fisheries, then energy, then today, critical minerals. Next 2 weeks is food and beverage manufacturing, and then finally ending off with forestry, wood, and construction industry. And the goal and objective of this series is first to understand the Canadian sectors impacted by these tariffs, understanding what it looks like for our future outlook and plan for the future. We can discuss policy and trade responses and hear from what the industry professionals have to say from their perspective. My intended outcome is that we can co-create together. And it begins with making sure that we really listen to these speakers and have these conversations afterwards during our roundtable sessions, because that is part of our key takeaways. I hoped for us to understand what does it look like on the ground for businesses, for economic development professionals, students beyond. How do they apply that to our work? At the end of this whole series, I hope to create a supply chain resiliency strategy guide for businesses at the end of this series. Since we're talking about Canada's critical minerals today, I do want to overview about what they are. There are 34 minerals and metals. in a list that has been released in 2021 by Natural Resources Canada. As you can see, that the criteria is that the supply chain has been threatened and there's a reasonable chance of the mineral being produced by Canada. And it must meet one of the following criteria, which is one, essential to Canada's economy and national security, required for its transition to a sustainable low carbon and digital economy, and finally, positioning Canada as a sustainable and strategic partner within global supply chains. And as you can see in this chart of how these critical minerals are processed, it's so important in our economy, which I'm going to talk about quickly next, because this is Canada's competitive advantage. This is showcased in the recent Critical Minerals Strategy Report released by Natural Resources Canada in 2022. Why? Number one, the mineral sector makes up 5% of Canada's total nominal GDP, which is valued, and also this sector for Canada is valued at $102 billion in 2022, and 21% of Canada's total domestic exports. So very valuable. And during the time when we're threatened by tariffs, let's look inwards of what we have to give to the world. So a quick update from last session. And apologies for the quick edit. It is not May 8th, it is May 22nd. But I do want to state that it remains the same of the tariffs from 2 weeks ago to today. As oil and energy products still have 10%. 25% tariff on steel and aluminum products, which does impact our critical mineral sector, 25% on Canadian automobiles. However, that certain auto parts will have exclusions as long as they comply to CUSMA. One thing I do want to note is that there is a CUSMA review in July 1st, 2026. Around 1 year of time, many restrictions that Canada currently complies with CUSMA may change, and it's so important for businesses to understand how they can make their business continuity plan to plan for the future, diversifying their markets and how to remain resilient in their supply chains. And here's the agenda for today's session, where after this introduction, we're going to introduce our lovely speakers. And then we're going to dive into a Q&A and roundtable discussion where I really want to hear from you and your questions about this sector, so we can have this engaging discussion and really build solutions together. I'm excited to introduce our two lovely speakers. First one we'd like to welcome is Jason Rasevych. He's a proud Anishnawbe First Nation member and Treaty 9 signatory and national leader of Waawoono Consultancy and president of Anishnawbe Business Professional Association. With over 20 years of global experience, Jason has secured $750 million in capital for Indigenous-led projects and shaped groundbreaking economic reconciliation and Indigenous rights strategy across Canada. Today, we're going to hear insights from him regarding Indigenous rights in critical mineral sector, economic partnership rooted in respect and reconciliation, as well as lessons from decades of leadership in Indigenous finance, strategy, and governance. I also want to welcome Audrey Hlembizky, who's the CEO of TeamsynerG Global Consulting and Chief Innovation Officer of RJC Global Impact. With over 35 years of experience, Audrey built a bold, human-centered approach to building future-ready workforces through approach to bringing future-ready workforces through psychological safety, behavioral innovation, and inclusive systems change. I look forward to hearing about how she's going to describe her work in building resilient workforce in high-risk and high-impact sectors, the intersection of critical minerals, people strategy, and sustainability, as well as her model of whole person safety, are transforming leadership and learning across industries. First of all, let's get started with some questions. And I'm going to first pass it to Jason and then Audrey. First question being, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities facing Canada's critical mineral sector in light of evolving US tariffs and trade policies. Actually, pause for a second. Let's hear about you guys first. Let's hear about your work in this sector before we dive in to the challenges. So, Jason, could you share a little bit about your current work in the critical mineral sector?
Sure, Janet. Thanks for the introduction, and really happy to be here. I just wanted to acknowledge I'm on the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation in Thunder Bay, and paying my respects to the Anishnawbe of the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. A lot of my work, being from Ganoguming First Nation, has revolved around supporting and increasing Indigenous participation in decision making regarding land stewardship, and also governance and jurisdiction related to Crown Indigenous relations with James Bay Treaty Number 9 and other treaty areas. My community is signatory to Treaty Number 9, which is well known to cover uh, critical mineral zones such as the Ring of Fire. So for a long time, my work has been deeply rooted in advocating and empowering Indigenous nations in developments. And part of that, where you mentioned the Anishnawbe Business Professional Association, it's a nonprofit member-based group, and we've been doing this type of work for more than 6 years now. But also from the aspects of the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples and free prior informed consent. As we all know, this has become law in Canada with the federal government supporting that to royal assent. There's still challenges with provinces that are permitting projects, and understand we'll get into that discussion. But part of my role is also working with corporate Canada to respond to the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action. One of those calls to action is call to action number 92, which directs corporations working in Canada to adopt the principles of the United Nations Declaration and free, prior, informed consent in their operating policy. So we see a lot of reconciliation action plans come out. Part of what I do is help build those frameworks for companies to do it in a way that's accountable, to walk the talk from a quality assurance perspective, and also look at the new requirements with the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board for what companies need to do to report to the shareholders, the institutional investors, and the public at large, to ensure that they're reporting accurately to the status of their relationship with Indigenous nations, of where their projects are being impacted. There's other work that I do in critical minerals in regards to the partnership models. So looking at the negotiations between the nations and certain frameworks, part of the committee that's doing the regional assessment on the Ring of Fire from the federal government. And I've also developed impact benefit agreements and also exploration agreements between companies and communities. So in a nutshell, kind of that's a little bit about my background, and yeah, looking forward to the discussion here today with Audrey. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Jason, for your introduction and the importance of building that relationships and different models that work for who you're working with in the natural resources sector. So now, Audrey, I would like to hear about your work in the critical mineral sector.
Thank you. First of all, Jason, thank you. I'm happy to be here with you in this very important conversation, and with yourself, Janet, and everyone who's attending. My work experience in this industry is really all focused on the people, the future workforce, the human experience within a mining operation. One of the things that really inspired our organization to really focus on workforce development strategies within the social performance initiatives that a lot of these organizations are doing is that 62% of children from K to 12 and university never even hear about the mining industry And it really impacts the opportunity to inspire children to be able to want to be in mining, to be able, to want to be a geologist or work in social performance, ESG, any type of role, engineering, whatever that looks like in the mining space. And with 20% of our current mining workforce over the age of 55, we have all this wealth of knowledge that's going to be leaving very quickly, with a big gap in how are we going to really work towards an integrous knowledge transfer process. So you've got all this skills with aged workers. Sorry, I'm in that age group too, but with aged workers, and it's leaving our industry. So as a result, our company is really focused, TeamsynerG and RJC Global Impact, with RJC being our mining division. We're really all about bringing people, processes, and technology together to really develop and empower the future of mining worldwide. Um, and when we look at some of the critical risks in mining today, some of the top ones are an aging workforce, gap in trades, in our skills, and safety. So, as a result, one of our models is whole person safety, and it's really the opportunity to create a framework about developing these safety cultures. Why is that so important? Is because right now, around the world, specifically in North America, there's this view, this perspective that getting into the industry is not something safe, specifically for women. And that's actually not true. There's so much that has been brought into the mining sector, the natural resource sector in Canada, completely, forestry, agriculture, etc., that is really built in more policies and infrastructure to create a very safe working environment. Um, but we're only halfway there. So one of the biggest missions or passions personally as the CEO of TeamsynerG is, how do we humanize the workforce, the cultures that we're working in, to create a high level of talent, really improve on the ability to learn new skills and upskill, and then create a psychologically safe working environment where our mental health is not impacted. And this is a real strong conviction for us in all the systems that we've developed, including a system called Bioptrics, where it really is one of the first behavior driven and culture central learning management system that really allows for a neurodiverse learning needs that we are really going to need for the future. So where this really supports where we're headed in the future of mining is that unless we really build that workforce, we really are able to empower that knowledge transfer opportunities, we are going to have a big gap in our supply chain, because we're just not going to be able to have the people to do the work.
Thank you so much, Jason and Audrey, for really painting that picture of the current environment right now in Canada on the critical mineral sector. And now let's just bring it into, we have the threat of tariffs, and we see a lot of fast moves from the government, and also that can mean fast tracking a lot of critical minerals occurring, projects and exploration happening on Canada. I would love to hear from Jason on what your perspective is now, the biggest challenges and opportunities facing Canada's critical mineral sectors in light of the evolving US tariffs and trade policies, and given what the government has currently responded.
Sure. We all know that there's enormous opportunity for Canada to be a leader when it comes in to the transition, the just transition, the green transition, however it's worded, to to reach our goals as a country, to respond to our commitments around decarbonizing and lowering our emissions, and looking at better ways to deal with how we impact the environment and climate change. And part of that is exploring opportunities with electric vehicles and the entire supply chain with critical minerals. But we must also consider whose land this is on, and the aspects of treaties. In many of the discussions I have, I always preface conversations with, has anybody read a treaty before? And in many rooms that I go to, I find it at times, I wouldn't say surprising, but less than 10% may have read a treaty before and understand that document or interpret it for that part. And in Canada, we're a part of many number of treaties. In Southern Ontario, there's the Williams treaties, and where I'm on is Treaty 9. And those treaties speak specifically around how that land is to be managed, and how the land um, decision making between Indigenous peoples and the Crown is a shared process, that a Crown government cannot unilaterally make decisions for that land. We hear a lot about public lands, private lands, permitted lands, but when it comes down to it, those lands are on First Nations treaty lands, and those individuals have constitutionally protected rights under Section 35, duty to consult and accommodate. They've got treaty rights under their treaties to exercise those treaty rights. And they've got now rights under the United Nations and free, prior, informed consent. These rights supersede any government legislation. They supersede the Mining Act. And I don't think that the general public or even corporate mining companies fully acknowledge that. And that creates some challenges related to permitting. So when we see election campaigns around streamlining processes, yes, there's a need to bring minerals to market. Yes, there's a need to develop the economic case for these projects, but at what role are Indigenous peoples being elevated into that process is a key question. And I've had conversations this week about the tariffs, about Bill 5 in Ontario. And from an Indigenous perspective, there's the challenges are significant. I think with US tariffs and the global trade, that there's pressure on government, there's pressure on industry, there's pressure on all of us to fast track, but at what expense through these environmental assessment processes will that happen, and how will that minimize meaningful consultation and accommodation with Indigenous peoples? There's the risk around the critical nature of these minerals that could be used to justify bypassing Indigenous rights and concerns, repeating harmful colonial patterns of resource extraction, where our lands are exploited and our communities are left with the environmental social burdens. We've got to make sure that that doesn't happen. The biggest challenge is to ensure that we don't rush to secure supply chains, and that it doesn't trample over Indigenous sovereignty and the responsibility of Indigenous peoples of stewards of the lands. With the global shift, there is a unique opportunity to get this right. Canada's competitive advantage on a global market is consent, free, prior, informed consent. We've seen some positive things happen. The federal government has announced a doubling of the loan guarantee program to $10 billion. We've seen the province triple their loan guarantee program to $3 billion as of yesterday. So if these projects are going to be developed in true partnership with Indigenous nations, respecting our rights, our title, our decision-making authority, that there's more stable, predictable, and attractive long-term investment, regardless of shifting tariffs, this is a chance to build that resilient local and regional economies and truly share in the prosperity generated from our territories. And that is possible, but there has to be the political will from the government to share in that decision making, to share in that power to authorize these projects. And corporate Canada, the mining companies, need to understand of the process to do that with communities. So I think that's important in the spirit and intent of reconciliation.
Thanks, Jason. Is so important to ensure that true partnership occurs where both sides are understood and heard versus we need to react now. This is an emergency, which is fair. People feel a little bit uncertain. They want to do things faster, but how do we do things right to ensure that it gets done well? If it doesn't get done well at the end of the day, what's going to happen with our economy? What's going to happen with our jobs? And speaking of which, I'm curious about Audrey's perspective because you look at the globe from Africa, Australia, and I would love to hear from your global perspective and also your human workforce perspective, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities facing Canada's critical minerals given the impact of US tariffs?
Yes, Janet. Geopolitics always causes some sort of uprise when it comes to the business landscape, specifically in our resource sector. And when if we go back to what Jason has shared, which is really important, because someone like myself who would work with let's say the ESG area of a mining department, a mining organization, and specifically in the social performance space, there's certain, let's call it metrics that the ESG represents. And it was there and it was designed so that we could drive sustainability at a human level and a land and environmental level, um, across the board in the mining industry, in the global mining industry. And so if we go back even just a couple of years ago at PDAC, and that's like one of the largest mining conventions in the world. For anyone that's listening that is not sure what PDAC is, there was a acronym that was very loud, proud, and vocal, and it was ESGI. So environmental, social performance, governance, and indigenous. And it was really intended, you could see that a lot of the panels and the discussions, it was intended to educate. And when we go back to what Jason said, which is it's very important for everyone to be mindful about, is that most people typically, and I mean even the people working within the mining operations, have never read a treaty agreement. They're not very clear on what's expected. And how they learn about it generally is from the social performance planning. So when we look at social performance in the mining space, it's an opportunity for mining companies to really deliver on one, reconciliation, respect in the workplace, health and safety, and diversity, gender diversity, and real equitable initiatives that really drive inclusion. So when we take what Jason said and we look at what we're dealing with right now in Canada, specifically with the US tensions, trade tensions, tariffs, you know, when we have an opportunity to look at how can we reshape Canada's critical mineral strategy, it really is an opportunity to look at things from a root cause perspective. So in my experience, my personal opinion, if we are looking at a short-term strategy or at a long-term strategy, at the end of the day, we've got to look at where is the land, where are these operations doing business on? What land are they doing business on? And when we can look at things strategically from a workforce development perspective, because we know what's coming, and what's coming is we've got approximately, if we keep on functioning in mining in Canada the way we are, there's going to be a gap of 80,000 jobs that are not going to be able to be filled. And when we're looking at about approximately 11% of all jobs in mining today are by Indigenous people, people based on the land that they're on, we have a real opportunity to work with our Indigenous communities to develop, to educate, to upskill, learn new skills, and really develop that future workforce. So when organizations are putting together their social performance planning, investing into those types of initiatives could be a real game changer for Canada and really authentically look at reconciliation as not, and I say this with all respect, not as something that we need to check the box off, but more as a real measurable and meaningful action we can do for our people of the country, for our First Nations communities.
It's so important to recognize where are the mines taking place and the
Exactly.
communities that are involved in ensuring equitable prosperity occurs. I lived up north for 3 years, and it's everyone feels it when you are not committing to the community, where it's just a fly in, fly out because they didn't really plan that workforce coming in. They didn't really plan that project. You just came in and you expected to get the people. But you also need to train people, and it takes time, but you also have a budget that requires all this. So you need to plan this project actually years in advance before and plan your workforce. And I want to bring it back to how does it look like on the ground? And I want to go first to Jason on how do you have models of collaboration that you suggest for critical minerals development to be aligned with Indigenous rights and sovereignty? Like, I'm curious about what have you done, what has worked, what has not worked, and just perhaps insight for people who are working in the mining industry or have voice in that space. What would work? What should they do if they're not fully sure of how to make partnerships well in this space?
Yeah, I could hop in there on that point, and I just wanted to comment on the important point that Audrey made on the ESG side of things and sustainability. There is a standard setting process that is evolving with the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, and it's going into the mandatory requirements in the audit and assuring space in 2027. So this is real, that companies are going to not only need to report on their environmental uses of natural resources, water quality, waste management, emissions, but also the governance side of things, where companies are pretty advanced from a governance perspective for internal and external controls from an accounting perspective. But that S pillar around the social impact and human rights, there's huge evolution that's happening from an Indigenous perspective to tie human rights into duty to consult, into free, prior, informed consent. And going back to earlier comments that were made around reconciliation action plans, holding companies accountable to put that into policy. We see greenwashing issues come out and laws around that, where a company making a false claim on how environmentally friendly their operations are, or do not have the right type of compliance related to due diligence on their corporate reporting, are going to be penalized, and it could affect their brand reputation, could affect their financial credibility, could affect their social license to operate in the market. When we think of the Indigenous perspective, we hear of red washing, talking about companies' false claims on on how they're impacting or how they're benefiting communities. So this is other work that I do around sustainability advisory for companies. But I just wanted to mention that ESG sustainability accounting framework is evolving, and it is also now a big discussion with the regulators, the securities commissions, the securities administrators across Canada, to include that in the capital markets. So I wanted to include that comment, but to transition into your question around on the ground, there are positive. I think the biggest thing is engaging early on in the process as possible. We cannot stress that enough in the mining life cycle, that the time to engage is when a company has the first thought of doing anything on the traditional territory of the communities, and to approach the communities directly and identify what protocols the communities have for being engaged. We see mistakes being made where companies may not know what to do and they go to government. Government may not have the right record of which communities are impacted. They might not have that information in the database. They may be looking at it in a narrow way where government may not be including the watersheds as a part of communities that are impacted. And we see that happen with the Ring of Fire is the general public or companies that are planning to do what's called stakeholder management and the project management knowledge base is a flaw when we think of the aspect of rights holders. First Nations peoples are not mere stakeholders. They've got elevated and empowered responsibility as rights holders. We can't just treat them as a stakeholder in a life cycle process. And just what I've seen as a flaw is companies engaging when it's time to apply for a permit, and they're waiting for the government to approve a permit and then to direction on which communities to engage with. That's far too late to really develop the relationship. So moving from a transactional style relationship to one that's around long-term value. So that could only happen with early engagement, providing the ability to build out the opportunity, get to know what the community's interests and views are, and also develop an opportunity to develop a plan and co-develop a plan with the community, and lead to mutual understanding of how those projects could work for the long term. And I think out on the ground, that's really a good starting point. But yeah, a lot more I could add as that life cycle evolves. But I'll leave it there for that response.
Thanks, Jason. It takes time and understanding of what are the protocols, how to plan a workforce to like your company to understand the community you're diving in before you even dive in. And I want to bring it to Audrey on in terms of you do workforce transformation support in mining industries, and I'm curious about how you collaborate and do you have support or provide that collaboration support in your work with workforce transformation?
Yes. If we go back to ESG and if we look at social performance plans, or if we look at diversity, equity, inclusion metrics, and all that type of initiatives that need to be done, workforce development falls in those buckets very clearly. So, for example, if we look at diversity and we look at inclusion, we look at gender diversity in the workforce, and we look at the percentage of communities that are surrounding most of our current sites that we have now or possible development sites in Canada. There is a huge opportunity to, number one, bring more women in mining, really begin education at a very young level, starting, from K to 12, where we begin to educate on the opportunities of mining. And this really all starts in the social performance strategy. So there's one thing to have a metric that you need to meet. So a mining company sends out or shares publicly their sustainability reports. And those are all based on certain targets for under diversity, equity, inclusion, under their social performance metrics, their ESG, whatever that looks like. So if we look at that and we start there as a framework, like a goal, a number that we want to accomplish, and then we now put real action to it. Part of the importance of workforce development is the actual implementation plan. So strategy is one thing and idea is one thing, and that's typically where things stop, is that there's a lot of people doing a lot of things, but what actions are actually making a difference with humans, with people, at the front lines? Where are we going from 11% population of indigenous people working in mining to 20%? What do we need to do to get there? If we look at women in mining, if we look at young children coming out of school having an interest in mining education, what are we going to do with real, equitable, and equal actions to elevate those numbers, so that at the end of the day, 5-10 years from now, we're not having to deal with the issues of retirement and all that knowledge leaving the industry? We're dealing with, okay, how are we partnering up, creating more mentor programs where our senior leaders are now mentoring our younger leaders and really building that future workforce that we're going to need? So we already have the framework in terms of what, just like you're running a business, you need to have a certain profit, you have a certain overhead. If we looked at human capital in the way we look at operations, the mechanical, technical, functional side of operations, we would really be able to make a massive difference when it comes to the amount of human resources we would have available for the future of the mining industry.
Yeah, it's so important to start young, start early, and have people
Yes.
understand what is going on in terms of the trades, in terms of, yeah, just a company affiliation. It's beyond just being there and providing jobs. It's how do you engage the people that are there. And I want to ask a question to Audrey. Matt asked, I'm curious how wages have kept up with the cost of living in the mining industry.
Well, in terms of wages, mining it has to be one of the industries where the pay scale is more on the higher side. I think it's just like any other industry in terms of level of income, role opportunities, um, those configurations. But in terms of, can you earn a good living and maintain the way the economy is right now? There's a better opportunity in mining than there is in many other industries. But in all fairness to wage increases, it is elevating at the same rate as every other industry is. I don't see it fast tracking yet. I'm predicting, based on data that is being revealed on talent shortages, that when an organization creates an organizational design and they create work levels, from an equity perspective, part of their policy is that based on the level that you're working on, the work level that you're working on, that pay scale is to be equal and equitable for all people. Yet one of the things that mining is beginning to deal with is the fact that there is a shortage on specific skilled individuals. And what's happening is we're starting to see a shift in people with certain specific skills earning or being able to have more of a negotiation power during the hiring process. Two sort of different contexts to that question, but there is an opportunity based on the skills that you have to be able to have a better opportunity in terms of income.
I want to bring this perspective to Jason. I'm curious about how are First Nations communities getting that living wage, that equitable prosperity when a mining company comes into their community, because I've seen on the ground that there is still disparities that occur. Training is not available as we would like for everyone to get those jobs when I went up north. But I'm curious on your perspective, Jason, from doing a lot of those agreement work and being in community.
Yeah, it goes back to that readiness assessment and engaging with communities early on in the process. If part of the workforce development, human capital related to supporting healthy communities, educated communities to be able to participate, there's foundational issues that are being part of the community's priorities that need to be addressed so that the communities that are impacted in that area can fully participate or maximize their participation in the project. And there's systemic issues with the Indian Act, which is the federal government's legislation that create challenges for communities to participate. Housing issues, issues with basic infrastructure like clean drinking water, issues around funding to provide some of the ability to participate in these projects. I've seen good processes where communities are part of that, we're seeing an evolution of impact benefit agreements to now they're called long-term relationship agreements. And those long-term relationship agreements have different components. The community's role in environmental monitoring, which creates employment, the percentage or the commitment of the company to employ First Nation peoples in that project. Some have a first right to participate in the project. If there's a mine in their traditional lands in their backyards, they should have an opportunity to work in that project. But we've seen, there's percentages as well. Like we'll see some mining companies commit to like 20% of the workforce to be Indigenous. But even with those metrics, it's difficult to meet when you've got to upskill and train from a trades perspective people to be a part of the project. And there's an entire process to assess the workforce readiness in a specific jurisdiction. So we've seen like the good projects, like one of them that I've noticed is Greenstone Gold Mine with Equinox, and my community has an IBA or long-term relationship, and they worked for 15 years to make sure that the communities could participate. But given that there's still challenges logistically with travel, with childcare, with education, with getting people up to par with post-secondary, with skills trades training. But all of the framework of the agreement has that put into place where the nations could develop training programs and strategically develop partnerships with the education institutes and do culturally appropriate training in a way that meets their needs, not just the union style of training. It's not mainstream style of training. It's Indigenous led, and it supports that pathway for participation of those people, because that is the green light or the social license to participate, is to have the people that are impacted to be a part of the project. That has to be important, but there has to be the understanding that not all of the Indigenous people can support that development. There needs to be other people brought in to be able to bring the skill set to be able to supply it to that market. So that's one area, and then the other, there's more. I know we're coming up on time, but I wanted to mention on the business front, the set aside contracting and procurement opportunities, which is also an important training aspect for Indigenous peoples that want to be entrepreneurs, want to have a contract with the operator in the mine. And we're seeing many communities develop these agreements where they create a development corporation to be able to assume some of those set asides. And we're seeing that for a better reporting aspect for a company on their ESG. Well, if they could report their Indigenous spend and they could attribute it to their project, companies need to collect better data as to their workforce ancestry. And of course, there's going to be some privacy concerns on how those questions are raised, but it goes back to the company working in lockstep with the Indigenous leaders to say, this is how we're going to report from a framework of how many Indigenous hires we have, how many Indigenous contractors we have, to really support what we said we would do at the beginning when we were meeting with you with this project. And, and that doesn't even get into the financial opportunities from a payment perspective to support social programs and other infrastructure programs in the community so that they have an own source revenue stream that's not a part of the government transfer payments.
I love the holistic conversations that we're having right now of it's not just giving people money in this industry. It's not just let's just dig up minerals, but it's how do we make sure that we are supporting the livelihoods of people that live here for a long term, because you want a healthy community for a healthy business. And I'm going to bring this back to just tariffs, because once you have a threat coming in, it depends on your foundation. Where are you at? And how do you make your sector, your business more resilient? So how are the current proposed U.S. tariffs, for example, aluminum and steel, affecting the competitiveness of Canadian sourced critical minerals and processed minerals? And I will have one last question, if there's time. So Jason, would you like to bring it up first, or Audrey?
Jason, or I can address that. Well, when we look at the tariffs, so first of all, globally, and a lot of people will make a business decision sometimes based on an emotional reaction versus data. And it could look like upfront they're beginning to purchase a lot of extra supplies with the concern or the worry with the supply chain. There's all these different variables. But when we look at some of the tangible minerals that Canada is producing, we look at where they're located, we look at the production requirements, the processing requirements that are going to be required, the human leadership and skills that are going to be required. The positive thing that I believe is happening right now when it comes to this, what I call a little bit of an emotional tariff scare, is that it actually has us be more awake to what's going to be needed from an action perspective, a strategy perspective that we need to implement, versus the way typically mining operations, our natural resource industry has been functioning. We've been functioning at a reactive pace. So, especially when it comes to the internal culture aspect of a company, we're always reacting to situations versus being proactive. So, when we look at tariff tensions or trade tensions and we look at the tariffs, without being able to speculate from a financial perspective or from a real tangible threat perspective, because we don't have really enough data yet to be able to speak to that. I think the one thing it's allowing us to do nationally is take a step back to look at, okay, what are the actual data-driven, predictable risks that's coming towards us when it comes to mining? And then how do we look at how basically a tariff, for example, is going to further impact that risk? With that, we can now be very proactive in our planning versus be reactive, which is predictable in the next 2 to 3 years. Most operations are going to be reacting to something much more substantial than just talent shortage or talent retention or an aging workforce or safety concerns. So as much as we can look at it as a threat or a concern, I personally think it's an opportunity for us as a nation to be very proactive, really have an opportunity to look at our Indigenous communities that we're working with, look at the issues we're dealing with our First Nation communities, that we as a country are responsible for causing? What can we do to really close those gaps on workforce retention, workforce development, skill development, going back to, you know, the things that Jason just brought up in his last comment, was that when we look at inclusion as a value that our country wants to stand for, and in Canada we're known for that, inclusion is Indigenous inclusion. It is gender diversity. It is knowledge equity, making sure everyone has the same opportunities. And that's what I believe tariffs, the threat of it, let's say, is really giving us an opportunity to start working towards.
Thanks, Audrey. I'm going to bring this back to Jason with the last 3 minutes. On how do you see the impacts of the tariffs impacting the critical minerals and processing minerals in terms of your perspective in community, in Indigenous communities, and how do we make it more resilient in terms of businesses and communities in your perspective?
Yeah, from an Ontario perspective, we rely heavily on our trade with our colleagues to the south. Was recently invited to speak to Chiefs of Ontario about the impacts of tariffs on Ontario's First Nation participation in forestry is significantly impacted because of our commodity markets and our trade with the United States, and mining because of its reliance on the supply chain. There's many of that north-south trade that happens. So when we see the tariff impacts, I think, to Audrey's point, we have an opportunity here that has been put upon us to consider how we work better domestically, reducing trade barriers within our provinces. Looking at, I've noticed in Western Canada, we're looking at a Western grid modernization related to transmission. We're looking at how we bring product to ports from the Pacific Ocean right to Manitoba, right to Churchill related to that. And Ontario and Manitoba have announced an agreement to reduce barriers within the provinces. So if at one time we've had these issues of the provinces working together, can Indigenous leaders be driving and supporting that process across jurisdiction, across treaty areas, across regions, to help support and drive some of that high level thinking? It's easier said than done, but it's a huge opportunity to look at how we can collaborate and work better to resolve some of these issues. It's been quoted, there's $600 billion worth of natural resource development projects today in Canada. We've got a $10 billion loan guarantee, a drop in the bucket. So we need financing strategies to unlock the $600 billion. Also acknowledging there's a $350 billion infrastructure gap in First Nation communities. Closing that infrastructure gap is a huge economic opportunity. It will also rise a rising tide of raising all boats for Indigenous participation in these projects. And I guess lastly, on a last note, on the critical minerals, is looking at building our value-added capacity domestically related to processing our raw materials here in Canada, and looking at specifically investing in processing facilities and in partnership with Indigenous communities. That could be equity in the processing plants, joint ventures in these facilities, but making sure that they're held at the highest environmental standards that are informed by Indigenous traditional knowledge and Western science is going to be important. So I think in totality that approach will shorten supply chain issues, reduce our carbon footprint, but also ensure that we're doing it right when it comes to transporting raw materials globally.
Well, thanks so much for both Jason and Audrey for providing us a conversation that makes us think deeper of how can we work together Canada-wide in terms of strengthening our supply chain, supporting our communities, supporting our future workforce as a whole. And I would like to also introduce that we are having our next session on food and beverage manufacturing on June 5th. I hope you can be there. We have Chris Conway, who's the president of Food and Beverage Ontario, as well as Howard Tam, foodie-in-chief of Eat More Scarborough, providing an innovative way of how to promote goods. I'll see you next time on June 5th, and I'll just put it right up here as you leave so you can remember this so you can join us next time. It's always lovely to have us all understand a little bit deeper of what is happening in our world and how can we react. Thank you so much. And I'll bring it back to Francesco to end it off if there's anything else.
Thank you so much. No, I think you covered everything, Janice, so thank you so much. But I also just wanted to echo my thanks for Audrey and Jason for the great discussion today. Thank you, of course, Janet, for moderating and for helping us put this together. Thank you to everyone in the audience for taking the time to be here today. Just as a quick reminder, this session has been recorded. So it will be up on our YouTube channel in the next little bit. If you want to reference it for in the future, or if you want to share it with anybody who wasn't able to make it today, please feel free to do so. And also just to keep up to date with the next session and all of the other things we've got going on at CFL York, I've put all of our social media in the chat. And as Janet has shared here, my email is on the screen, so please feel free to email me any questions, suggestions, follow up, anything you'd like, and I'm happy to get back to you as soon as possible. So thank you so much one last time. It was a great session. I think we covered a lot of important topics, and I look forward to next week as well. So I hope to see everybody there, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Have a good day. Thank you so much. Bye for now.
Thank you.